Hello and welcome to the Game 1017 Assignment 2 overview video. In this video, we'll be going over the assignment point by point and going over the code and showing some of the functionality for the code and the assignment based on the requirements. So we'll start at the bottom where the requirements are. We'll start by looking at the game engine code, then moving on to the UI, the player, sound background, obstacle generation, aesthetic and polish, and finally whatever remains. So for the first point, we can look at the code here. We have the engine that has been properly created with the required code and as well as the proper definitions for it. The engine has a singleton, which is in the main, an instance of an engine. The next points to look at are the states. So we'll look at the state classes and all the state code for the update, the render, the enter, the exit for each state, such as the start state, the pause state, the play state, and the end state. So here in this code, this is where we have our states defined. We have our title state code here, our definitions, the game state, the pause state, and finally the end state. And over here in this states.cpp, we have the code for all the states that has been written. And in each section you can find the different state that works. So for example, in the title state, here at the beginning in the enter, we enter the title state, then we load a background, a title screen background. We have a button, a start button. We have the obstacles. We also have a music track that is being loaded for the title state to play. We add the child for them. Going down, we render the title state. And finally, when we're done with the title state, we exit it. Next, we have the pause state. In the pause state, we have simply just a button being rendered, some text, and then we have the update for it, the render for it, and the exit, which unloads the button when done with the pause state. In the main part of the game state, we have most of the textures and audio and sounds and music for the game being loaded and the beginning at the enter. So here we have the player being loaded, we have the tiles being loaded, which the player will stand on top of so they don't fall through the ground. And then we have the scrolling background textures, which are being loaded. There's about 7 of them, which will scroll. There's a child for each of them being added. After that, we have the jump sound effect being loaded, the rolling sound effect, so when the player rolls, there's also a sound effect. Another music track, a different one, being loaded and played. And then we have the death sound effect, which unfortunately does not work, because one thing that I was not able to figure out was the collision detection for the player and the sprites, which we'll see in a bit. When the player collides with the sprite, they're supposed to be defeated. However, the code for that doesn't work as intended. And unfortunately, because of that, subsequently, the end state, which is supposed to trigger on player defeat, also doesn't trigger on player defeat. It does, however, trigger if you press the X button, which we'll see right here in the game state, which allows you to quit the game at any time. However, it does not work as per the instructions for player defeat when colliding with the hazard as far as the instructions are concerned. So moving on, we also have a timer as well, and the score being added and loaded into the game. These are the tile levels, which are kind of hidden. They allow the player to stand on the platform and not fall through. So in the game state update, when the player presses X at any time, they're able to exit the game and quit, essentially. By pressing P, they can pause the game and resume it with either pressing the button again or clicking the button. There's two ways. You can press the R to continue, or you can click the button that you'll see. The player can play the game basically and run through the level, which is randomly generated obstacles that rotate. And then down here in the game state exit, we have all our objects being unloaded. So the player, the obstacles, the scrolling backgrounds, the sound effects, the music tracks. Here we have the timer being resumed. When we go back from the pause state back into the game state, we resume the timer. And here at the bottom finally we have the end state. And in the end state, we basically end the game. We load a button that says game over and some instructions that tell the player what to do to go back to the title screen by either pressing N or clicking the button. That is also available. We update it. We render out, of course, and then when we're done with the end state, we exit it and switches back to the title state. In the button class, we had to create a couple more extra buttons that achieve these functionalities for the pause button and the end button on top of the play button that is already there. In the timer, we have the labels and being created for the timer, and the same thing goes for the score. We have the score labels being created and rendered to increase the score. The way the score works in this game is as the player continues to play, as the obstacles pass the screen on the left side, the left border of the screen, you would add a score to the total score for the player. So if we look here, so in this part of the text, when the player is playing the game, as they pass each obstacle safely and avoid colliding with them if the collision was working appropriately. And this is the collision code that doesn't work correctly. So as the player is playing the game normally and clearing the obstacles and not colliding with them, as the obstacle, when the X, the width of the obstacle and its X position passes the furthest left edge of the screen, which happens to be an X value of 0, then we add score to the player basically, and they gain score. They gain 50 points of score. About. It's a bit buggy. Doesn't work as it should, but it does work. If we can find the obstacle row, there's another part of the code here that it's obstacles that adds the score as well. When the destination of each obstacle is beyond the leftmost border of the game, then it does add the score. So let's look at the game being played, and we'll go through this again to show what part does what and how it works. So here we have our, let me lower that, it's a little loud, isn't it? Okay, so there we go, sorry about that. So the title screen, as we can see, there's a button. You can press it. Here's a little splash background for the game, a little bit of text. And the button works when you click on it, obviously. And then here's the part where the player is playing in the game state. And the player is able to jump. They're able to duck. Although the rolling is a bit glitchy because it's supposed to animate and then repeat the animation, but I couldn't really figure out how to do that. I tried a few different things and it still would not animate again. It would just be stuck on the last animation of the, the last sprite of the rolling animation. And as you can see the score, every time an obstacle passes the border, it increases it. Now the player is supposed to collide with these and die, but obviously, as I said earlier, the code doesn't work for that properly. Couldn't really get it to work. But however, and ideally, the player would collide with these obstacles and they would be defeated and then would go to the end state. The timer works as well. When you pause the game, you get the little pause screen which tells you to either press R or click the button to resume. So by pressing R, we continue to play. And then at the same time, when we press the continue button, it also continues. So it works as intended. There's also a soundtrack in the background, although it's a bit faint right now. Now when we press X, or if the player was able to collide with the obstacles and be defeated, then the game ends. So now by pressing X, you get the game over screen, which also would work if the player was able to collide with the obstacles. And here it tells you to either press N or click the button to go to the title screen. So we can both click the button. As you can see, it's clickable when you hover over it, or press N to go back to the beginning. And then you can start the game again, which is no different. So I think that about wraps up most of the requirements for the game. All the buttons work, all the different textures are loaded properly, the player moves properly, they're able to turn left and right, they can jump, they can roll, however the animation is glitchy, there's sound, the sound works, the sound for the death animation, which we can't do, is right here, and because we couldn't get the collision of the player working, we couldn't also get the sound working on it properly because we don't have a collision that properly occurs, which means we couldn't also create the collision for the player. And right here, if we look here, we can see where all the animations are created for the player. So we've got the idle one, the running one, the jumping one. We've also got the rolling one. Ideally, we would have a case where it's state defeat for the player. But however, we were not able to do that because, and we would also define it here in the enumerator animation states in the game object. We were not able to do that, however, because the collision was not working, and all these are connected together and they depend on one another to work properly. But ideally, we would have a death animation that would also work here in the code at the bottom of the rolling animation for the player, platform player.cpp. That about wraps up the entire Game 1017 Assignment 2, which is a side-scrolling runner game with a platform player. Thank you, and take care.